1, 2, 3.
The following is the full Uncut conversation with Naomi Klein and Laura Flanders from our episode Tackling the Doppelganger, Disinformation, and the Hidden Threat of Individualism.
Roughly halfway through her new brilliant book, Doppelganger, Naomi Klein describes doubting herself. It was early on in COVID. She had published her concerns about the for-profit response to the pandemic, and that's what you'd expect from the author of The Shock Doctrine, a book all about the way that private firms and authoritarian regimes use disasters to their own advantage. Klein was being Klein, doing what she's known for, but suddenly another Naomi, Naomi Wolf, was all over Fox News spinning a scary conspiracy theory about a fascist takeover. Wolf's version of events wasn't the same as Klein's, but it was enough like it as to confuse some people. At that moment, as Klein writes, she backed off. Not completely, but too much, she says. Quote, I couldn't see how a serious discussion of actual disaster capitalism could avoid getting blended with truly dangerous anti-vaccination fantasies and outright coronavirus denialism.
When I look at the mirror world, I don't see disagreements over a shared reality. I see disagreements about what is real and what is a simulation. And with AI generating more and more of what we see and hear, it's only getting harder to distinguish the authentic from the synthetic.
If you recognize that problem, you will have lots of aha moments reading Doppelgänger, a trip into the mirror world. In it, Naomi Klein, author of No Logo, This Changes Everything, and so much more, describes her doppelganger experiences with Naomi Wolf and the painful catch-22 of defending one's personal brand or deciding not to. In it, she lays out the myriad, mostly sinister ways in which shadow selves show up in our lives and in our society at large, and leaves us with a big question. How do we reconnect with one another and prioritize collectively as we need to address our shared problems in an era when divide and conquer has become so granular and our personal identities so fragile and so seemingly all-important? No doppelganger, I am proud to welcome the real Naomi Klein. It is a pleasure to have you back, and thank you for another great book.
Well, thank you for having me, Laura. It's so great to have an excuse to talk with you.
The last time we talked pre-COVID, it was about climate and a book you had written about the climate crisis. At the end of Doppelgänger, you say that you were actually on track to write another, like a follow-up to that book. What happened?
Yeah. Well, Laura, as you said in your introduction, this book is an attempt to grapple with many of the wild and unsupported conspiracy theories that mark our time and that have gained so much force during the pandemic and now are kind of mutating and really manifesting in the real world. We've seen an attempted coup attempt in Germany. We've seen we were now seeing RFK Jr.'s very odd presidential campaign, which is really feeding off of this conspiracy energy. Before I go on, I want to just say, as a lifelong leftist, some conspiracies are real. As you mentioned, I wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine that really told the story of the rise of neoliberalism through much of what people in the center might describe as conspiracy theories, right? But were real successful attempts to overthrow democratically elected governments, behind the scenes deals imposed by the IMF, and so on. So I use the term conspiracy theory to describe unproven, unhinged fantasies, really, that are not connected, not supported by facts. So I just want to first say,
I mean, conspiracy is really just people working together to a shared end, right? In one way. But as you say, the word has gotten a whole lot of other meanings.
Yeah, and it is often used against leftists in order to dismiss us, right? So I want to be clear about what I'm talking about, and to come back to your question about climate. Even though this book is not directly about the climate crisis, I think it is in lots of ways, because the role that these particular right-wing I think maybe a better phrase is conspiracy culture, because the theory is not coherent in any way. It's really just throwing disbelief at the wall and seeing what sticks. The theories very often contradict each other, right? One minute, COVID is a bioweapon, and the next minute it's just a cold, and why should you even wear a mask, right? The point is to question any organized power. The point is to make people disbelieve their reality. If that is happening, if sometimes it would seem that half of the population in your country and mine is taking this flight into fantasy, then how are we going to tackle any of the real crises that we face? And first and foremost, in my mind, is the climate crisis. It's not the only one, but we're not having disagreements anymore about different interpretations of a shared reality. We're having disagreements about who is in reality and who is in a simulation. And that is not a good place to be when it comes to tackling any shared crisis. Doppelgangers are often understood as a warning or an omen, a message that something needs our attention. Reality is doubling, multiplying, glitching, telling us to pay attention. Because it's not just individuals who can flip into a sinister version of themselves. The Earth can transform into a menacing, uncanny twin of what we once knew. Whole societies can flip. That's the reason many doppelganger works of art are ultimately about the latent potential for fascism within our societies, even within ourselves.
So take us back. I mean, there you were. At that time, you had an appointment at Rutgers University in New Jersey. You hadn't been there all that long. Suddenly, the pandemic hits. I remember talking with you early on. You're wondering where to be, what to do. But boy, have you been on a journey since. Have you been, as you say, on a trip into the mirror world? What took you there?
So I left the States, like many Canadians who found themselves in the US. Those of us who were able to return to Canada, no offense, we chose to. It was a better place to ride out the pandemic. I was able to do my teaching for Rutgers from our home in British Columbia. My parents live here. They're in their 80s. They were vulnerable. At first, we thought we were moving here temporarily, but then when we figured out that we could work from here, we decided to stay. And it is a very isolated part of the world. It's spectacularly beautiful. I mean, there are giant cedars and there are orcas and all kinds of wonderful comforts from the natural world. But it is, 3 hours to the closest city, which is Vancouver, which is not a very large city. So, like so many of us who were fortunate enough to isolate, I went online more than I usually did. I'm just gonna confess this, Laura. I try to keep my social media use under control. I block Twitter on my phone, and but in the isolation of the pandemic, I realized that so many of the external forces that tell me who I am, and I think ourselves come from a mix of the internal and the external, right? We are social animals. We mirror each other to each other, and missing my friends and missing my community, my political community, unable to do so much of what I know as a student of shocks helps orient us, which is gather, which is re-narrativize our moment. That was precisely what was most dangerous, right? We could do it online, we could go to an outdoor protest, but face-to-face gatherings inside were very, very hard, very dangerous. And so I went online to try to get a little of that kind of validation. Who am I? And I experienced this vertiginous thing of having just, I could scroll forever and at a certain point during the pandemic and just hear the denunciations and the excommunications and how could she say this? How could she do this? And they were not talking about me, though they were naming me. They were talking about the person who I've come to refer to as my doppelganger, Naomi Wolf, because during COVID, she became a kind of doppelganger of herself. And I think this is also something that might be familiar to some of your viewers and listeners, this feeling of like, what happened to this person? Like, I used to know who they were, but suddenly they seem very different. I used to be able to trust this person's analysis, and now they're sucking up to Elon Musk. I'm not going to name any names, but there are a lot of people.
There are plenty of them.
There are plenty of them.
So it wasn't you. It was Naomi Wolf, but your name was being used. That must have been kind of horrifying.
Well, I think it was, and particularly because of the timing, because the truth is I have had these little identity confusion moments with her for more than a decade now. I never saw it as more than a little annoyance, but so many of us were online too much, on social media too much, kind of panic reading, like not reading closely, and looking to these corporate platforms for our sense of community. And at one point, I think the most horrifying moment was when somebody tweeted something to the effect of, what the hell happened to Naomi Klein? I used to respect her. Now she's comparing COVID vaccines to the yellow star, right? Which is one of my doppelgangers activities that I have the most trouble with. I do not like the Holocaust analogies, And so I looked at what he was linking to, and it was an article that clearly said Naomi Wolf in the headline, So I responded, I said, "Are you sure about that?" And so he went back and he reread what he had shared and saw that he had been reading so quickly that he saw my name in a headline that had her name in it, right? And so he said, damn autocomplete. And that's when I realized that we were getting confused so much that the algorithm, the AI fueling these platforms was now prompting it. And that meant that however I responded would only fuel it, because the algorithm is not smart, right? Even though it's called intelligence, all it's doing is seeing these two names are constantly referred to together. So anything I do gets conflated with her. And that's when I realized I had a problem on my hands.
I would love to say it isn't true any longer, but when we've started typing in Naomi, both of you show up. Just saying, sorry.
Well, look, there's two ways you can respond to something like this, Laura. You can be horrified by it, and I was for a while. And then something happened. I instead of being horrified, I just got interested. I got interested in the phenomenon of all of our kind of interchangeability on these platforms, right? The fact that we're all not really ourselves. We're creating an avatar, a doppelganger of ourselves to represent us. AI can create deep fakes of us. I started reading books about doppelgangers. I started reading, everything from Dostoevsky to Philip Roth to Ursula Le Guin, looking at the role of doppelgangers in mythology, Catherine the Great. And one thing that became clear is that doppelgangers often are warnings. They're often telling us, they're offering us something that is hard to look at directly. So they give us a kind of mirror to look at instead of looking at the thing directly. And so I thought, well, instead of just pushing this away, what if I draw it close? What if I really give it my attention and try to understand the messages?
So you did.
I had
just
fun
quickly
doing it.
Well, you clearly did, and it's a sort of fun read in the sense that at least I constantly stopped and had a thought. It's a real thought-provoking book, and you travel, as you say, and you take a real trip, and you take us on a trip.
I have a doppelganger. A person who does many extreme things that cause strangers to chastise me or thank me or express their pity for me. I used to be horrified by this, but then something happened that I didn't expect. I got interested in what it means to have a doppelganger.
One of the places you go is into history and the origin of doppelganger. Just for people that aren't familiar with that term, where does it come from? What's it refer to? So it's a German word, and it translates literally as
as doppelganger, goer or walker, right? And some of the mythology around doppelgangers holds that all of us have a double walking around somewhere, and we could find ourselves suddenly, walking down the street and bumping into someone and finding ourselves looking into what seems like a mirror. And I know people who've had that experience, and it's very unsettling. My doppelganger is less that kind of doppelganger, and that when I look at her, I don't see myself, but other people clearly do, or they see our digital representations as interchangeable. But yeah, that's what doppelganger means.
No, one of the things that you refer to is the history of people who have lived, as it were, kind of dual existences, whether it's James Baldwin talking about African Americans always being sort of both inside and outside themselves. I think of John Berger, Ways of Seeing. I can remember where I was when I read his book and he talked about the male gaze.
Yeah.
And I realized, oh, that's what I've been feeling. It's kind of like Barbie in the real world, where she's suddenly experiencing this free-ranging anxiety and type of violence that she hadn't been experiencing in Barbie Land. You can tell I've been going to the movies. What's different in this moment of sort of hyper-capitalized technology?
Yeah, those are all great examples, and I think they're examples of the doppelganger that we recognize, that we can see, and that is a real phenomenon, that you look at someone and go, wow, that person looks like me. And then what Baldwin or Du Bois was referring to when they were talking about a double that is imposed on them from the outside, right? So that is a double created by white supremacy, where Black people are viewed interchangeably, and a set of character traits are projected onto them, same as what patriarchy projects onto women. And so that's one of the ways that I grapple with my doppelganger, because my mother sees it all as anti-Semitism. She said to me one day, like, why are you drawing attention to it? It's clear that they just both see you as kind of mouthy Jewesses. So then I go into, the history of the oldest and most persistent conspiracy theory, which is that of the cabal of Jews, pulling the strings behind the scenes. And of course, many of the COVID conspiracies are moving very quickly in that direction as the pandemic recedes. But there's a desire to continue to tap into that energy and power of conspiracy. And that's, I think, the part, where the book ends, because it takes a winding road, but it does go somewhere. Anti-Semitism is often referred to as the socialism of fools, right? Because it offers a false analysis of power, right? So something is unfair. That there are people who are profiteering, who are enriching. That you're getting a raw deal. But instead of offering a socialist analysis of capital that says this is what this system was built to do, you say, no, it's just this group over here. Capitalism is fine, but there's an aberration. There's this cabal. And that's why conspiracies tilt to the right, and why people like Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson understand that they serve their project, and why they've platformed my doppelganger quite a lot, precisely because it protects the system, right? If you are deflecting away from a systemic analysis towards this idea that there's a cabal, then the system is safe.
So there's two things I'm hearing going on. One is this kind of vacuum at the heart of our understanding of the world, which you could say is kind of left by red baiting and anti-communism and fear of talking about systems and power and class and all the things you talk about. And into that vacuum flows these kind of stories of bad individuals and evil and abstract forces out to get you for no particular reason, that kind of free-ranging terror. There's also the other side of the story, which is there's a lot to be gained from telling certain stories and less so from others. So what's the difference? Which one of those do you want to pick up on first? You've touched on the first, and I blame the media a lot for failing to give us enough airtime to clear, complex analysis like yours.
Yeah. And I mean, the media, the education system, right? I mean, capitalism is treated like the air we breathe. It's not really generally identified as a system that has its own logics, and that these outcomes, including outcomes like the real conspiracies that I mentioned earlier, are produced by the logic of a system that is designed to pursue profit at all costs and growth at all costs, right? If we think about the conspiracies that I wrote about in the Shock Doctrine, like the overthrow of Allende, there was a conspiracy to overthrow Allende. It wasn't about draining children of their adrenochrome, or some sort of nefarious demonic goal. It was to protect, the U.S. copper mine sector, who were angry that Allende had nationalized the copper mines. And it was U.S. telecoms who were worried about him nationalizing the telecoms. So real world conspiracies tend to have a more kind of a banal end goal, but they are real. And I think that, yes, we don't learn about those systems. We don't learn about those logics. In fact, we're lied to about them. And we're told that actually, a rising tide is going to lift all boats, and that this is the best system imaginable, and everything else has been tried and failed. And so because we lack this systemic analysis, and people are experiencing true hardship on many different fronts, they're looking for answers, and the conspiracies come along and say, "Aha, I have them." It's Bill Gates. It's the World Economic Forum. And look, I'm no fan of the World Economic Forum, but my analysis of the World Economic Forum is it's just a logical outgrowth of capitalism.
Yeah. It's not an evil cabal. Well, we can get into it, but but so then that brings us back to COVID in a sense, because at that moment, you had this perfect kind of nexus of people needing healthcare that they couldn't afford, or they thought they couldn't afford, their own personal economies being in danger, no clear story for what was really happening, and an awful lot of time online. How do you see those things as coming together? And what about that profit motive piece at the center of this, where there's a lot of money to be made selling crank cures and remedies?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll start there, right? So when I wrote the Shock Doctrine, I was looking at two different sort of elements of ways that large-scale shocks are exploited by people who are already wealthy and powerful. One is as a democracy avoidance tool, right? In moments of shock and emergency, we tend to just be focused on getting through the day, staying alive, staying safe. They aren't generally moments of high democratic engagement, right? So, which is why, we have attempts to privatize the education system after Hurricane Maria, which and successful attempts to do so after Hurricane Katrina. I wrote about in the context of Iraq. So you have this kind of policy wish list: privatization, deregulation, ram it through during the emergency. So that's one kind of shock. The other is what I refer to as like the disaster capitalism complex, right? Which is really just seeing the shocks themselves as a profit center, that being part of the privatization. And so in this sort of late stage of neoliberalism, we've already privatized much of the commanding heights of our economy. So what's left? Security, disaster response. And that is what, in the aftermath of the Iraq War, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, we started to see, Blackwater come in and Halliburton and the whole gang, right? Where I think conspiracy theories are different, are a new twist on disaster capitalism, is that in the attention economy, which is, one of the largest parts of our economy now, engagement is money. Engagement is the path to monetization. And there's little else that will generate more engagement than telling people that the jab the shot that they're told that they have to take, or their kids have to take, is going to kill them, or is already causing a genocide. I mean, that's a good way to get clicks. And so the conspiracies themselves are an industry in a way that we haven't seen before because of the attention economy. So I would start with that. Not everyone is dogged by their doppelganger, but our culture is crowded with all kinds of doubling. All of us who maintain a persona or avatar online are kind of creating our own doppelgangers, forging a separate public identity that is both us and not us. A doppelganger we perform for one another as the price of admission in a rapacious attention economy.
So what do we do about that? I mean, you describe, and it rang so true, that when you hear a story that makes sense, an analysis that makes sense, like the one that you just laid out about why did 50 years ago the Chilean coup happen, there's a kind of aha and you exhale. When you hear, oh my God, there's evil abroad in the world and it's out for your children, you get excited. That it almost feels like a physiological phenomenon that your friend Johan Hari might describe or talk about. Is it physiological?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Berger, right? Because, when I sent John Berger a copy of the Shock Doctrine in galleys, as one does when
he's this great social theorist of the 60s on to recent, not so long ago, coming out of the UK.
One of the true greats, and a truly generous and gentle man. And so I sent him the Shock Doctrine, and he sent me back a quote that I really cherish to this day. And what he said is that the book made him feel calm, because there is a calmness and that we feel when reality is. I mean, I think for someone like John, who was on the front lines of many of these struggles, right, and that so much of it was denied, it was calming to have it mapped like that. And I feel that way when I read an analysis that is rooted in fact and that is confirming things that I experienced but maybe didn't have a name for. It makes me feel calmer. Now, that I also think we have a right to get mad about injustice, and I don't think that sense of calm is the opposite of anger, but it is what we need in order to act. We need a kind of a pause. We need the ability to take a breath, assess, and think about what we're going to do next. And so, exactly as you say, I'm really struck, when I listen to, and unfortunately I listened to hours and hours and hours of Steve Bannon in order to write this book.
Dirty work, but someone's got to.
So you don't have to. The goal is the precise opposite, and I would put my doppelganger in the same category. It's to instill panic. That seems to be the main outcome that is being sought. And when people are panicked, they can't think straight. And like I said, I think we have a right to be mad, but we should do our best to get out of that panic state and to get into a more lucid state.
Well, that takes me back to the attention economy that you mentioned earlier. I mean, time is a minutely measured thing in the attention economy. Billions of clicks in fractions of a second can be generated by things. Lies, as they used to say, can travel around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Well, now the truth doesn't even have a chance to click. It does seem to really make a difference, doesn't it?
It does make a difference. And I think it's easy to feel helpless about that because we don't control these social media platforms. I think that people, because we know that to be true, very often we think that the solution to this is deplatforming, right? Just get them to shut up. Don't let them do it. What I've seen is that's actually kind of supercharged the movement. People really wear it as a badge of honor. When Wolf was suspended from Twitter for about a year until Elon Musk brought her back. And the first thing she tweeted was deplatformed 7 times and still right. And it's currency in conspiracy culture. How many times have you been deplatformed? That's how right you were, right? Because the powers that be don't want you to be heard. And of course, there are what I call mirror world platforms, right? When you get deleted from Twitter, you go to Getter. When you get deleted from YouTube, you go to Rumble, and so on. I am less interested in how we control speech and much more interested in how we drain conspiracy culture of its energy, of its power. I don't think it's not about changing Steve Bannon's mind, but it is about looking at why he has such a following, how he is attracting people who would, just a few years ago have identified as being on the left, as being progressive. What stories can we be better at telling that replace the, socialism of fools with the socialism of facts, if you will? I do think that we can do that better. And you started the interview talking about that moment where I felt like, well, can I write an article about Bill Gates without it not just fueling this? And the conclusion I come to is, absolutely, we must write about Bill Gates. We must write about Davos. We must not cede this territory to conspiracy culture, because if they are the only ones who are talking about the hoovering up of wealth during the pandemic, if RFK is the only one talking about how billionaires massively enriched themselves during the pandemic, and he's hitching that to all kinds of dangerous and untrue things, then we're in very bad shape. So I believe that that right-wing conspiracy feeds off of left-wing silences, and we need to step up.
Get louder.
Yeah, get louder, more confident. And all the while, tech companies create digital profiles of us without our full knowledge. Data doubles, or golems, that follow us everywhere we go online, carrying their own agenda, their own logics, and their own threats.
The other side of the doppelganger story that you lay out so interestingly in the book is, since when did we only have one self anyway? What is our attachment to a rigid brand, if you will? And you talk about how you identify a lot of this in No Logo, and it's sort of been updated for the moment, that attention economy logo. What are the plus sides of saying we have, Walt Whitman? I include multitudes, and you talk about disability actually giving us a kind of superpower lens into living in different realities. I thought that was a fascinating part of the conversation.
Well, I'm so glad. And I really do feel this book, books are always so profoundly incomplete. And all they are just offerings to other people to think more,
Yeah.
Add to, I have just this very particular experience of doubling. It's very unique to me, but I hope that when people read it, they're like, oh my God, this is like what's happening to me. I shared it with my friend Molly Crabapple, who I've collaborated with on films. Molly, the amazing visual artist who I'm sure you've had on the show many times. And Molly is experiencing this extraordinary doubling through AI, where if you type in, that you want to see a certain sort of city in the style of Molly Crabapple into one of these programs like DALL-E, it'll spit back something that looks uncannily like Molly's work. So though this, I experienced doppelganging, I regret to inform you, we're all going to be experiencing this far too soon. But this issue around the self, like I said, my first reaction was like, must protect my name, must protect my, if you will, my brand, must be the last Naomi standing. And then I just thought, this is really interesting. I when I wrote No Logo, I always said I didn't want to be a brand. I've always thought the idea of personal branding was absolutely toxic. I think it has damaged not just ourselves, but our movements. I teach undergrads, and they're so troubled by this idea of having to perform a self for the ether that is not them, but that others perceive as them. We've seen, I believe, many movements fracture over kind of cult celebrity activism of people who are better at building their own brands than building democratic social movements. Another theme that I think you've discussed a lot on the show. And so even though it's not fun being confused with somebody who's spreading all kinds of dangerous medical misinformation, I actually feel weirdly grateful for the experience, because it has taught me to hold on to myself a little less tightly, which I think we all honestly need to do if we're going to do real collective work.
Elaborate on that.
Well, so we live in this age where we're told that we have to optimize ourselves in all these different ways, even if we don't use that language. And that is, the ultimate expression of the success of capitalism and the neoliberal phase, precisely because we are uncared for, precisely because we are isolated. We put everything onto the self, right? We need to polish ourselves up. We need to perfect ourselves. We need to optimize ourselves. We need our families to be perfect. We need our kids to be perfect. And the pressure that we're putting on the self, I think, is part of why we're seeing so many people crack. I don't think the self can support the amount that we are putting on it, because it's our income, it's our retirement, it's our safety, it's our lifeboat in this wild world, right? And it's an illusion, because we cannot protect ourselves from the forces that we're up against. We can only, our only hope of protection is through collective work and collective movement building. And so, I think the reason why doppelgangers recur so often in the culture, and even just think now, right? Dead Ringers on Amazon. There's so many Netflix shows. There's a new one, Who Cloned Tyrone? There's the new Black Mirror, where there's everybody hates what's it? Anyway, one of the Black Mirror episodes. They're everywhere. Doppelgangers are everywhere in the culture. And some of it is clearly an attempt to grapple with AI. But it's older than that. If you go back and you read Dostoevsky's The Double, which has been remade in many films, it's grappling with the precariousness of the self. We're told that we have power over our lives, but the truth is ourselves are inherently precarious. We can be undone in an instant. It could be a psychotic break. It could be a car accident. It could be a terminal illness. It could be a disability. We can polish ourselves all we want, but we are not ever going to be totally in control. And the idea that there could be another us who could upend our lives, and that's the story of every doppelganger novel, is a reminder of the precarity of the self. So we can either try to respond to that by kind of armoring up and doing more to armor up ourselves, or we can kind of embrace it and say, well, if everything I've done to build up my public self can be undone because countless people are confusing me with someone else who is doing things I am horrified by, well, I may as well just give up. And there is joy in giving up, I'll tell you.
Well, it also takes people to buy into the bait and switch or into the confusion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where I come at the end of your book, is we all need to connect better in person, or at least remember what we know about people. Mm-hmm. I recently had a chance to talk to Shirley Sherrod, the Georgia Agriculture Department development director, who was forced to resign under the Barack Obama administration when she was slandered basically by Andrew Breitbart in a whole trumped up video that somebody in the Obama administration believed more thoroughly, more quickly than they believed Shirley Sherrod. Long history, civil rights. That one video led somebody with some smarts to, on a dime, abandon what they knew about her and believe instead the lie. And apparently they didn't even ask her for her side of the story before asking her to resign. That story sits with me because it speaks to how quickly we can abandon one another. Yeah. And that's where I end your book, in the sense that how do we connect in a way where we're not so vulnerable to lies about one another, where we actually believe what we know to be true about Naomi Klein, that she is not about to be sitting there with Steve Bannon. I know that's not you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. I think that is part of it. I also think it's hard. I mean, I have trouble keeping people straight online. I mean, there are at least 5 people named Alex who I can't keep straight. Because I've never met them in person. I think that this points to what you're saying. These are not real relationships. And because they're not real relationships, it's a lot easier to confuse people. So we have to, I think, be real about the fact that we don't know each other just by following each other on Twitter. But I also think that, the example you gave, that was a lie. But it's also true we make mistakes, and that we're very quick to believe the worst about people. And this is another aspect of doppelganger analysis and literature that is interesting. Freud wrote about doppelgangers that they represent the vast potentialities of ourselves, right? We know that we are all leading lives that are the result of a series of choices made by us and made by others about where we live, what families we were born into, what job we took, whether we had kids or didn't have kids. So there are all these other lives we could have had that we don't have because of different choices. So that's another way of being interested in doppelgangers, is being interested in the idea that we could be different, right? And I think COVID showed us that too. It wasn't all terrible, and I think it's really important, because the narrative that it was tyrannical to ever ask people to stay home is getting so much oxygen right now through the RFK campaign and in other ways, to remember that actually there was a beauty to that first year when we were really reckoning with our interconnection, when we were really thinking, well, who else is breathing this air? And do they have sick leave? Can they stay home? How can we support them? How can we support the workers on the front lines? And I think one thing that I'm really troubled by is the way in which there's a lot of cynicism. There's only cynicism about some of the ways that people expressed appreciation for frontline workers. Oh, remember when we all clapped on our balconies? That wasn't all terrible. I mean, what's terrible is that we didn't turn that clapping into policy victories. But when I look at a lot of the rapid growth of conspiracy culture, particularly in the wellness world, a lot of it is, small entrepreneurs who were playing by the rules, who really believed in self-optimization. They really believed in capitalism, even if it was like green capitalism. And then suddenly they were told that their yoga studios had to close. Suddenly they were told that they, like my doppelganger is a landlord, or she used to be, and she was really angry that she had to give her renter a break, right? So I think we need to look at this from a systemic point of view. These are people who believed the lies capitalism told them, that all they needed to do was play by the rules, make their money, protect themselves, protect their families. And now suddenly they were being told that they lived in a community and in a society, and they had to care about all kinds of people, including people who didn't look like them. And I think that made a lot of brains break. But the other side of it is a lot of people embraced it. And we can't forget that so many people had been waiting to be asked to check in on their neighbors, to form mutual aid networks. And I'm just worried we're forgetting that.
Mm-hmm.
What I've learned by shadowing my double is that the forces that have destabilized my personal world are part of a much larger web of forces that are destabilizing our shared world. And understanding these forces may be our best hope of getting to firmer ground.
Well, I really encourage people to check out the book. I really do, Doppelganger. But before we close, a couple of questions. One is, there's a distinction that you draw that's super helpful between the far out and the far left, as a concept that the media seem to kind of blur together. And they did specifically around this question of vaccines. I've had people who are sort of tending towards the RFK camp saying, well, since when did you become the big defender of big pharma? And I'm like, whoa, I'm not the big defender of big pharma, but nor am I joining the anti-vax team.
Right. And I mean, this comes back to what we were talking about before, about how we should have, I believe the left should have been louder about real vaccine apartheid, which was not unvaccinated people not being able to go to a coffee shop, in Oregon. It was the fact that we who are fortunate enough to live in the wealthier parts of the world, our governments hoarded vaccines. And despite the fact that the development of the vaccines was funded through public money, in large part at public universities. And despite the fact that the whole business model was our governments buying these vaccines, we were offering people their third and fourth shots before most people on the planet had even gotten one. That is vaccine apartheid. And we should have been screaming nonstop. There were lots of, the people who were raising this, but we didn't build a movement around it the way we have in the past. At the height of the AIDS crisis, when WTO intellectual property protections were keeping generic drugs from reaching the global south, there was a lot of organizing around it. And we need that kind of organizing once again, so that it's very clear that no, we are not defending big pharma. I don't think private pharmaceutical companies should have ever had their hands on the vaccines. I don't think the vaccines should have ever been patented. But what happened is that this became the terrain of the loonies, and so we just ended up being like, get your shot, too many of us. And yes, we had our critiques, but were we really loud enough about those critiques? So that's one of my questions. And to your question around the far out and the far left, I really do object to the horseshoe theory analysis, this idea that the far right and the far left meet at their respective ends, because what we're seeing is not the far left. We're not the far left, as we know, are serious Marxists, people who have an analysis of capital. Where we're seeing a coming together, or sometimes it's called diagonalism, a migration of people who had been associated with the left or with, in liberal circles, moved to the right. It's overwhelmingly what I refer to as the far out, right? So these are people more in the wellness sphere, and it's a very entrepreneurial sector. It's not very, it's sort of left-ish more than it actually is left. And so I think we need to sharpen that up a little bit in our understanding.
Well, clearly we need to build our media so that we can be louder, try as we might. We're not there yet. I think there's just one other area I wanted to ask you about. I didn't know the history of your mom. I didn't know that your mom had a stroke and all of that. And my father had polio, and I felt like, and I grew up with him always in a wheelchair, but also always being a celebrity. And your mom was a respected person who had a stroke. And I wondered, as I thought about that, it's like I grew up with someone who was simultaneously super famous and respected, and if people didn't know who he was, treated like a cripple, and as having no agency. And I just wonder what that did to me, what it does to you. How does it help us grapple with complexity, perhaps, or dual selves? I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Laura. It's interesting that you and I haven't talked about that before. My mom had a stroke when I was 17. So she made documentary films, and was, well known in Canada. And that was before her stroke. Her stroke was quite debilitating. She was able eventually to do some work and make a film about disability. But through her, I was exposed to the disability rights movement. I'm very grateful to that. And also the way the world treats people with disabilities. And of course, I have a son with autism, so I sort of have it's a presence in my life, the way the world reckons with difference. And I do think it has had a pretty powerful impact on my rejection of social Darwinism. I don't think I was ever really inclined in that way, but the idea of just kind of survival of the fittest, it just felt like a personal attack on my family. It always did. And I do end the book with some wonderful quotes from Sonora Taylor, who's at UC Berkeley and a fantastic disability rights theorist, and also lately has been writing really powerfully about the connection between our ecological crisis and what environmentalists can learn from disability justice, and the disability justice framework. And she makes the argument that we are in a state of mass impairment, and that our world is impaired. And, I think it all comes back to worldview. If your worldview is that everybody gets what they deserve, if you're having trouble, it's because you did something wrong. If you have success, it's because you did something right, and that you're only responsible for your individual little family or little pod, then that state of impairment is you can't really metabolize it because you see it as failure. You only see failure. And so I think that what this moment calls for is just an ethic of care, of a really profound care, and belonging. And it's hard to see how this kind of winding world of doubles brings us there. I think it does. And I think particularly when it comes to our kids, there's a lot of this anti-vax, the whole anti-vax misinformation network is building on a pre-existing misinformation network that was focused on the lie that there's a connection between childhood vaccines and autism. And because I have quite a lot of experience in the autism parent community, I have seen a lot of that firsthand. And so, in the Shock Doctrine, I talk about Milton Friedman telling people to have their ideas ready and waiting until a crisis presents itself. That was true of the autism vaccine myth. That whole world, and RFK is the biggest star in that world now, him and Jenny McCarthy, that world was ready for COVID. And that's why they were able to churn out the misinformation so quickly. But what troubles me most about that world is not the misinformation per se. It's what it's saying to these kids. It's just a refusal to accept that there could be disability in your family, that there could be difference in that family. So you're looking for someone to blame, right? And you hyper pathologize it. And you don't think, well, how can the world change in order to include my kid? In order for my kid to belong, you instead go on this crusade to try to find somebody to blame. And I just really worry about the message that sends to kids who are different.
Well, with that, let's draw to a close. I end most of my interviews nowadays by asking people what they think the story will be that the future tells of this moment. What do you think? What do you think the future, 20, 50, whatever you want, years from now, will say of now?
It's a great question, Laura. I mean, I don't feel like I can confidently predict a story that is inspiring. So rather than answer it by saying I think this is the story that will be told, I think the story that could be told if we all work very, very, very hard, is that we had a wake-up call in 2020, where the illusions of separateness and of individualism fell away. And there was a huge amount of resistance to that because people had been told a lie. They had been told that their destiny was entirely in their hands and that they were all islands. And so the truth of that revelation led to all kinds of derangements in the culture, conspiracies and trucker convoys and all kinds of weirdnesses. But then the organizing of everyday people in their communities and in their schools was such that those fantasies were not able to carry the day, and that we came back to the truth that we all shared in those tender moments in 2020, the interconnection that we saw in the response to the pandemic, in the racial justice uprising that summer in my country, when graves were identified at residential schools, and we built a different kind of world.
Ojalá. Let's hope. Let's hope it not be a doppelganger mirror world, but really the one that we create together. Naomi, thank you so much. What a pleasure. And congratulations on another really important book.
Thank you so much, Laura. So much fun to talk with you.
You too. At the end of Doppelganger, Naomi Klein talks about the benefits of activism. Not just winning or losing campaigns, but the experience of coming together with others outside of our digital worlds to pursue a goal together. The relationships you build in those kinds of struggles often last a lifetime. And I look back on my own life, and I am grateful that I had those experiences in my youth, many of them in the anti-nuclear movement of the early 1980s. In thinking about that, I'm curious what would happen if we took time out of time to find people in our close community who remember living in a pre-digital and perhaps differently capitalist world. Have you spoken to the oldest person in your neighborhood? Perhaps asked them about their grandparents, what they remember? I'm resolving to do that again because I think we need to be reminded that what we live with today has not always been with us. We not only can live differently, but we have. And people in our close-up vicinity can remember how things used to be. For more information on this week's show, check out our show notes at patreon.com/The LF Show. This show's produced by yours truly, Laura Flanders, with Sabrina Artel, Nat Needham, David Neumann, Jeanette Hernandez, Sarah Miller, Rory O'Connor, and Jeannie Hopper. Stay kind, stay curious. Until the next time, for the Laura Flanders Show, I'm Laura.